recent Iowa State University study shows that even the most modern dry spinner fertilizer applicators with recent calibration can still not achieve accurate spread patterns. In this particular Iowa State University study, the applicator was calibrated to apply 216 pounds of fertilizer material per acre across a 60-foot swath width. But when pan tested by Iowa State engineers, 30 feet of the 60-foot swath directly behind the midpoint of the applicator only received 177 pounds of fertilizer material per acre. In other words, 40 fewer pounds of fertilizer material than what the machine was calibrated to apply. Liqui-Grow, however, has developed a fertilization systems approach that eliminates the problems associated with inaccurate dry fertilizer applications. We use cost-effective high-nutrient analysis liquid suspension fertilizers that are more viscous than clear liquid fertilizers, but can still be precisely metered with rate controllers and flow meters to ensure every acre of every pass is receiving the agronomic rate of fertilizer prescribed to maximize crop yields and economic returns for our customers.
We are loyal to Liqui-Grow for several different reasons, but first and foremost, we think it's really about the professionalism and the trust that the employees here have, and we have the confidence in their ability to make things happen when we need it done. We know that when we can call Liqui-Grow and have a quality job done very quickly, if the weather's changing on us, we think that that's really important to our operation. So it's about the professionalism and it's about the trust that we have in the people and the equipment that they have here. We're also pleased with the relationship with Liqui-Grow because it's been such a long-standing relationship for us that we've got the confidence in their financial strength and their ability to recommend products to us based on what we need.
I know who the owners are. I feel like they've got their employees, their customers' best interest in mind when it comes to doing business, and I feel really comfortable that if I place money with these guys, not going to be issues down the road, making sure that that product gets to my farm, in a very efficient and professional manner.
Really, it's the people, flat out. It's the people that move my business forward because they are the expertise that I need to be a better farmer.
My name is Scott Tinsman, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Liqui-Grow Twin State. For the past 60 years, our success has been driven by the ability to add money to the farmer's pocket. Our belief is if the farmer spends $1 with us, we should be able to provide him $1.50 back.
My name is Hovey Tinsman, President of Liqui-Grow. I believe in liquid suspension fertilizer because it allows us to make the right product at the right time and apply it at the right rate for the most efficient benefit for the plant.
We play an important role in making sure we can get as much information to the farmer that's state-of-the-art as possible.
We prioritize R&D investment because it is our goal to prove in the field ways in which new technologies can make things more profitable for our customer.
What I like most about working with ag is truly the people. They're just nice people. We're all working toward a common goal, and that is to be the most efficient, productive farmers we can be.
Hi, I'm Katie Hess, Seed and Seed Treatment Manager here at Liqui-Grow. And behind me is the mural titled Breaking the Prairie Sod, painted under the direction of Grant Wood. Grant Wood was an American artist, most famously known for his painting American Gothic. And he was born here in Iowa, Anamosa to be exact, and lived most of his life in the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City area. So we thought it was really fitting to use this as our backdrop today because he was born on February 13th and died on February 12th. We thought it was ironic that we were filming today at Iowa State in front of this mural, and it happened to be close to the time that he was born and passed. So we wanted to share this information with you, as today is February 11th, and we have our next topic, soybeans, the little things that make the big difference. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Greg Tilka from Iowa State University and our very own Dr. Jake Vossenkemper, lead agronomist here at Liqui-Grow. So we hope you really enjoyed today's presentation and this beautiful mural.
Good morning. Welcome to the Liqui-Grow Lead Academy sessions. We're very happy that you can join us today, and we hope to see you at the sessions that we're hosting for the rest of this month. There will be 3 more next week. The presentation on fungicides and tar spot from yesterday is now live on YouTube, and you can access it at any time. We have 3 more sessions next week, as I stated, and you can find a full schedule of all of our events on our website, and they will also be posted after we go live. They will be posted here on YouTube for your access at any point in time. There will be a QR code during the Q&A, so you can just scan that with your phone if you are looking to use this to get CCA credits. We hope you enjoy this exciting presentation on soybean cyst nematode and all things best practices for the upcoming growing season. We're very, very excited today. We have a guest speaker, Dr. Greg Tilka from Iowa State University, joining us. At the end of the presentation, we are going to have Q&A with Dr. Tilka and our other presenter, Dr. Jake Vossenkemper. So stick around afterwards. As all of our other sessions, just like those, you can submit questions at any point in time through the YouTube chat function below the video, or you could submit them via email at questions@liqui-grow.com. Enjoy the presentation, and we will see you right after this for Q&A.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our lead session. So today we have traveled to Iowa State University because we wanted to talk with Dr. Greg Tilka. So Dr. Tilka is a world-renowned expert in nematology. He focuses on soybean cyst nematode management. And I have seen Greg talk on many occasions, and Greg does an excellent job at delivering information that is practical and focused so the farmer can help make management decisions to increase their yield and profitability. So Greg, thanks for doing with us with this today.
Thanks for having me.
So Dr. Tilka, my number one biggest concern when I'm out talking to farmers out in the countryside, talking about agronomy and soybean cyst nematode is, I just don't think folks grasp the amount of impact or yield reduction that soybean cyst nematode can truly have on soybean yields. Can you further expound on that?
Well, the first thing I would want to say is amen. I agree with you completely. It's an interesting paradox in that soybean cyst nematode universally is considered the most damaging soybean pathogen in the United States and Canada, and yet my perception is that it's something that's not on most farmers' radar screen. The reason SCN is the most damaging pathogen is due to a couple of its attributes. The first one is it's so widespread. So because it's the most damaging pathogen, we track where it's been found in the United States, and we publish an updated map every 5 years or so. The most recent map was published in January of 2021, and it represents the period between 2017 and 2020. And in that short time span, we had found soybean cyst nematode in 55 new counties in the United States and dozens of new counties and rural municipalities in Canada. And the message there, when I show the map of soybean cyst nematode and what counties it's been found in, is it's spreading to the peripheries of where it's already known to exist. But the take-home point for everybody watching this video is if it's spreading to new counties in states where it hasn't become widespread, or in Canada, it's also spreading within my state and your state and every other state. So it's spreading from field to field as well as from county to county.
I've even heard you say it's probably spreading within fields.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good point as well. It starts out, since it's moved by things that move soil, it's going to start in one particular area of a field, but over time it will spread throughout the field. Now, I'm a researcher at heart, so I love numbers and data. And so in the mid-1990s, we did a random survey of 6 states in the Midwest, and we literally had people who worked for the Ag Statistics Service at USDA randomly select fields throughout Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and Ohio. All those samples came to Iowa State, and we tested them for SCN. And Iowa, for example, we found SCN in 74% of the fields. In Illinois, we found it in 83% of the fields. So it's very widespread. Now, that was in the mid-1990s. I was able to get funding to repeat that exact survey just for Iowa 10 years later in the mid-2000s, and we found it in 71% of the fields in Iowa. And then finally, I just did it a few years ago, 2017, 2018, and it was in 73% of the fields. So it's very widespread throughout the heart of soybean land in the Midwest, but ask yourself or ask out loud how many fields are known to be infested, and that number would be nowhere near the 50s, 60s, or 70% range. And the reason for that is that you can have a field infested with soybean cyst nematode and it won't look sick. Now, most farmers would think, since this is the most damaging pathogen, that you're going to see giant areas of stunted plants and dead plants. And we do see that sometimes, especially in drought years.
Yeah, and you know, SDS is a very visual disease,
Yeah.
you know, and farmers are commonly worried about SDS. But I think if you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you look at the numbers, SCN is actually a bigger yield reducer than SDS, right?
Yes, it is if you deal with data and facts, but it isn't if you deal with perceptions in the farming community.
Right.
And our big problem is fields can look perfectly healthy and have up to 30 or 35% yield loss. The thing I try and tell farmers and agronomists is just get in a habit of digging roots and looking for the little white SCN females in every soybean field, not just in the fields that look stunted and yellow and look terrible, because you could be missing it for literally 5 or 10 years if you're waiting for the crop to look sick.
So Dr. Tilka, you know, many of the folks that are watching this video, they recognize that there's some resistance or some resistance genes that can combat soybean cyst nematode, okay? But what I don't think that is readily known is that those resistance genes or mechanisms are starting to fail us. Can you tell the audience, you know, what you've seen develop over the last 20 years you've been researching soybean cyst nematode?
So first, let's start with the facts about what exists for farmers to use. So my job at Iowa State is research and extension. Managing SCN is the backbone of it is resistant soybean varieties. So I'm very interested in keeping track of what's available for farmers to use. And I've put together a list of cyst-resistant soybeans to help farmers know what their choices are. And I've done that for 30 years now, dating back to the early 90s. And in the early 90s, my first list fit on the front side of a single sheet of paper. There's probably 15 varieties or so. We publish this list every fall, so the publication was updated in fall of 2021, and there was 872 varieties on the list, the most recent list. So it's been a tremendous success story of varieties coming to market with farmers, for farmers to grow with cyst resistance. And in fact, a bit of trivia, it's hard not to find a variety that has SCN resistance. Or another way to say it is, it's hard for me as a researcher when I want a susceptible soybean to find one, because almost everything is marketed as having SCN resistance. Now this publication it comes out as an ISU publication, extension publication. If the viewers wanted to search for that online, they could simply Google ISU extension PM, capital P, capital M, 1649, and it'll take you right to a page that you can download a PDF file that gives all that information on those 872 varieties. Now, talking about the diversity of resistance, back to your question, there are 7 main breeding lines that soybean breeders can use to introduce resistance genes into good yielding soybeans that don't have resistance. They have weird names that start with the letters PI, which stand for plant introduction. It's kind of a breeding term, but there's 7 main ones, and then there's also hundreds of other obscure soybean breeding lines that have been discovered and published in the literature. So the reason I explain all that is there's lots and lots of diversity of available resistance genes. But unfortunately, in the lists that I've put together over 30 years, I can track the diversity that shows up in varieties that farmers have available to use, and that diversity is pathetically low. Another way to say it is virtually everything a farmer has to pick from has a single source of resistance genes, and it's from the breeding line called PI 88788. So again, I track the available varieties. I also track the source of resistance, and for the last 15 years or so, we're stuck at about 95% of the varieties having PI 88788, and the remaining 5% mostly is a source of resistance called Peking. There is a newcomer. There's 2 varieties currently for 2022 that have a source of resistance called PI 89772, but really the 2 main choices for farmers are 88788 and Peking, and 95% of the choices are 88788. The final point I want to mention, even though there's hundreds and hundreds of varieties out there with PI 88788 resistance, they don't all yield equally and they don't all control the nematode equally. So there's quite a bit of variability in the performance of those 836 varieties available for Iowa farmers that have PI 88788 resistance.
So I have a little bit of a follow-up question.
Okay, sure.
So I was just doing this the other day with a grower. So, he wanted my recommendation on, what soybean variety should he plant. Okay, so we were going through a bunch of yield data from various sources, and, we're looking for the best performing, genotypes that are out there, right? And guess what? I couldn't find any Peking, so. But there were some Peking varieties that maybe they were just a few bushel from being the highest yielding cultivars we could find.
Okay.
Do you think, to break up that cycle of resistance development, do you think it'd be a good idea to plant some of those Peking varieties, even if they're not the best thing on the market? And I'm talking a couple bushel.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good perspective. We at Iowa State University have the nation's largest variety evaluation program for SCN resistant varieties, and we see very similar to what you just described. We see the Peking resistant varieties yielding pretty darn well, but maybe not the top in an experiment, but maybe in the top 5 or top 10. But most importantly, we collect nematode data from those plots, and we see tremendous high numbers in the soil left behind by the high-yielding 88788 varieties, but not the Peking varieties. And so it's literally just a matter of time before the Peking varieties are going to rise as the top yielders. And it's as much about their genetics on the plant side, but also about the genetics of the nematodes in the soil. The nematodes catching up to the PI 88788 resistance, and the inevitable outcome is lower yields of soybean varieties that have PI 88788 resistance.
Excellent, thank you.
Now, if I can get a little geeky on you and the viewers, again, I told you I'm a researcher.
You can get geeky on me.
Okay, so I'm a data guy. So your question was perfectly timed, because we do these variety trials at 9 locations throughout the state, and we've done them for 30 years. And one of the first things we do, well, we publish the results, first off, I should say, for farmers and agronomists. So if a viewer wanted to see an annual report of these trials, you could, again, hop on Google or your favorite search engine and just search for ISU extension IPM 52, and you'll see the newest report. It actually came out in January of 2022. But one of the things that's very important to us that we do is measure the nematodes that are in the field. We rent from farmers to do these experiments, so they're farmers' fields, and we carve out about 3 to 5 acres for our experiment, and the farmer host that we rent from farms the rest of their land. We establish plots. There's hundreds of plots in each experiment, again, 9 locations throughout the state of Iowa. We pull a 10-core soil sample from each 4-row plot. So that's about 3,000 soil cores for the entire experiment. So it's extremely fine resolution mapping of our experiment.
I'm glad I'm not your graduate
Yeah,
student.
well, yes, everybody has very large biceps in my program from poking holes in the soil. And we do that twice. Once isn't enough. We do it when we plant, we do it again at harvest. So for every 4-row plot, we harvest the center 2 rows, we know the yield, and we know the beginning and the end of season numbers. So we know how the numbers changed in the growing season, and we can relate that to yield. The last thing we do in the spring, after we've processed the soil that we collected, the samples for numbers, we take all the leftover soil and we test the nematode that lives in that soil. Remember, it came from the farmer's field that we're renting from. We test it against the different sources of resistance. So earlier I showed you a list that had all the 7 different PI lines, which are the breeding lines or sources of resistance. So we take the farmer's soil that has the nematode at the beginning of the experiment, we grow the pure PI 88788, the pure Peking, all the different sources of resistance. We grow them in a greenhouse for 30 days, and then we look at the roots. And at that point, there'll be new SCN females on the roots. They look like little white dots, and we're able to count those, and we compare how well the nematode reproduced on those different sources of resistance compared to a susceptible. So I know it's kind of weird for people to think about nematodes and female counts and so forth, but think of it if you pulled a sample of weed seeds from a field and then you sprayed a sample of those weed seeds with 7 different herbicides, and you simply asked the question, what % were killed by it? And you compare that to a water control check or something.
That's a really good analogy.
Right, yeah, so that's kind of what we do. It's called a race test or an HG type test, but it gives us a female index, and it's a number of females that would form on the resistant source divided by the susceptible. So let's just use 88788 because that's the number that represents the resistance that's commonly available. If in this experiment there were 200 females on a susceptible and only 20 females on average on 88788, the female index would be 10%. There were, in other words, only 10% of the females on pure 88788 compared to the susceptible. And the reason I'm explaining this kind of nerdy calculation that we do is we can look back over our 30 years of experiments and see how the nematode has changed in farmers' fields throughout the state of Iowa. So we did exactly that. So I looked at recently all of our data for 30 years and looked at what that female index was for just Peking and 88788, because those are our 2 main choices. And in the 1990s, PI 88788 worked very well. Those female index or % reproduction on varieties that had PI 88788 and on pure 88788 were less than 10. But then starting in the year 2000 or 2001, we started to see the reproductive level of the nematode in those farmers' fields elevate on pure 88788, and it just looks like a blob of dots that over the last 20-some years is getting higher and higher, and what it represents is the nematode adapting to or breaking down the resistance that's PI 88788. And then, of course, being scientists, we like to look at more data. We did the same thing with Peking. So again, I look back at our results from the early 90s and asked the question, how well did Peking control SCN in those farmers' fields? And in the 90s, Peking almost allowed 0% reproduction, almost 100% control. But starting in 2001, it still held its own. Most of the reproduction is below 10%, but over the last 20 years, we might have encountered 7 or 8 or 9 fields that had SCN with relatively high reproduction on Peking, but nothing like PI 88788. So that's completely expected if you believe in natural selection as Mother Nature controls what happens out in farmers' fields. And it really shows us that the PI 88788 resistance is losing its effectiveness, but Peking resistance is not. Now, the final thing I tell farmers is that elevated reproduction on PI 88788 cost farmers bushels per acre. And the example I use is an experiment we did in 2019 on sandy soil in southeast Iowa. We look to sandy fields to give us the most extreme results, and sure enough, in this experiment, we had 3 susceptible varieties, we had 2 Peking varieties, and we had 60-some varieties with 88788 resistance. And at the end of the season, the susceptible varieties yielded about 40 bushels per acre. The resistant varieties with PI 88788 yielded 50 bushels per acre, and the 2 Peking varieties that were in experiment yielded 72 bushels per acre. That's a 22.5 bushel per acre yield difference. So early on, you asked a question, what are we losing in terms of yield with 88788 losing its effectiveness? In this field, we were losing 22.5 bushels per acre. Beans were $9 a bushel that year, so I penciled that out to about $200 in yield loss an acre. And then the farmer who farmed around us, because we just rented a small part of the field, he grew a bean that yielded 50 bushels per acre. At that $198 an acre, he lost nearly $5,000 because he used 88788 resistance and not Peking resistance.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow.
it's mind-numbing. The final point, again, not to get too geeky with numbers on you, is I told you earlier that we pulled soil samples from every plot that we ever plant. So at the end of the season in this experiment I just described, with a 22.5 bushel per acre yield difference, we also had egg counts. And the egg counts under the varieties with 88788 averaged about 14,000 eggs per half a cup of soil. And the egg count under the 2 really high yielding Peking varieties was 800 eggs per half a cup of soil. 14,000 eggs versus 800 eggs. So that's going to carry forward. If the whole field was grown to the Peking variety or the 88788 variety, those eggs are left behind, and that's what's going to be waiting in the soil the next time soybeans are grown. So there's a tremendous yield loss, and then it's like compound interest on a loan. Not only do you have tremendous yield loss, but with 88788, the problem's getting worse, and then you might have even more yield loss moving forward.
The thing that I find interesting, a couple comments. You know, that farmer probably walked away and said, 50 bushels isn't what I wanted,
Yeah.
but it also wasn't 30 bushels. I mean,
Right.
50 to 60 bushels
Right.
is not a good yield, but that's not uncommon,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
So you could have walked away thinking there was nothing, it had nothing to do with soybean cyst nematode, but it did,
Right.
right? The second thing I'd like to say is, you know, when a farmer's talking to me and he says, you know, my soybean yields just aren't what I think they should be. The first thing I say is, have you taken a soybean cyst nematode sample lately? Do you know what the egg counts are? The second thing, you know, piece of advice I would give a farmer if your soybeans just aren't what you think they should be yielding would be plant a Peking variety in a split planter situation with the PI 88788. If the Peking variety does 5, 10, 15 bushel better than the PI 88788, that's a pretty good indication on its own, I think.
you got yourself a problem. Yep.
Yeah.
But I would also encourage a farmer to think progressively and maybe try and not get to the point where they're losing that yield. So that takes a really progressive, forward-thinking farmer that should try and integrate Peking resistant varieties preemptively rather than as an afterthought. But it is a good way to kind of do a reality check on if you want to know what yield you're losing due to 88788 SCN resistance, plant some Peking beside it and see what you get.
Yeah.
So I kind of liken it to high blood pressure in humans. The breakdown of SCN resistance, 88788 resistance, is a silent killer, if you will. It's you don't know you're losing it. And there's people walking around with high blood pressure, and they don't know they have high blood pressure until they go into the doctor's office and they take a reading. That would be the equivalent of a soil sample. And then the other thing is, you don't just have one high blood pressure reading. My doctor, every stinking time I go in there, they slap the blood pressure cuff on you. And so what that translates to is multiple soil samples over the course of years. Doesn't have to be every year, but you really need to keep an eye on what your SCN numbers are, because you might have it and you might be losing lots of bushels per acre and not know about it. So the way I summarize the whole situation is almost every SCN resistant variety that a farmer has to pick from in the Midwest has 88788 resistance, and we certainly have strong data showing that that resistance is not working optimally, and we have data showing that it's reducing yields, but the farmer might not recognize that's all happening.
Can I ask you another follow-up question? So, soybean cyst nematode sampling takes time. It costs money, and those are two things that retract folks from taking SCN samples. I don't know that I know the answer, but I think I'd like to see what your thoughts are on this. So if you farm in an area, you're geographically fairly close to one another, you have 70% of your soils represent a pretty similar soil type. The other remaining 30% represent a different soil type. Could you sample in one of those fields pretty routinely? One field that's got this similar soil type and the other field that's got this similar soil type, and could you use that as a diagnostic indicator of what my whole farm might look like or not? Or do you think that you need to sample every field?
Yes. Well, I'm a numbers guy, and so the researcher in me would say you really should sample every field. But I'm also a practical person, and I'm kind of lazy. And so, if you absolutely have ruled out that you are never going to sample all your fields, then your mindset is hard to argue with. That if you can kind of categorize your farming operation into similar type fields, maybe varying by topography or geographical location or whatever, soil type, I guess it wouldn't be, the results from any individual field should be somewhat correlated with results of similar fields. It shouldn't be random. So it's not ideal, but again, I'm a realist, and if you're telling me you're never going to do every field, so you're not doing none, right, you're not doing any, then you'd be, yeah, something's better. That's a perfect way to put it. Yeah.
Excellent. So Dr. Tilka, we've talked about PI 88788 and Peking, some of these conventional breeding genes. I'm hearing rumors of some transgenic genes that might be coming to market. What do you know about that?
So what I'd like to say about SCN resistance, genetics, and diversity, first off, I want to remind you that we put this list together every year. It lists all the varieties available in late maturity 0 and maturity 1, 2, and 3. It's primarily focused at farmers in Iowa, but it would benefit farmers in those same maturity groups throughout. And we do this every year. It was updated in October of 2021 if the viewers wanted to see that publication, and it contains the source of resistance. It tells you if a variety has Peking or PI 88788 resistance. You just simply have to search online for ISU extension publication PM1649. Or if you could track me down online, send me an email, or send Jake an email, we could send that publication to you. Absolutely. So in the most recent publication, 836 varieties had 88788. 34 varieties had Peking resistance, and there were 2 newcomers, 2 varieties that had a third different source of resistance called PI 89772. So that's kind of the traditional answer to your question, Jake, about resistance, the sources of resistance. But there's another exciting development coming down the pike, and that is that in the summer of 2020, the US EPA gave BASF approval to advance development of a BT SCN resistance. And the folks at BASF published a paper on it. It is Bacillus thuringiensis, and it's a cry protein, but it's a cry protein that affects soybean cyst nematode and not the insects that it has been used against in the past. If you wanted to get that paper and read it for yourself, it's available online. You'd simply search for cry protein, CRY protein, and SCN, and the paper should pop up. It was published on June 7th of 2021. Or again, you could ask me or Jake to send it to you. And so that's not available right now, and it might be another 5 or 10 years before that BT SCN resistance becomes available to farmers, but it's kind of a glimmer of hope there that we're turning the corner, and hopefully we don't continue to be reliant on PI 88788 resistance.
So we talked about a lot about these resistance genes, whether they're plant-derived or they're transgenic. What are some other management practices that farmers can use to help combat soybean cyst nematodes and yield reductions due to them?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because managing SCN isn't just about resistant soybeans. It's also the other foundational backbone of managing SCN now and moving forward will be growing non-host crops. And we are really, really lucky that the other main crop in the state of Iowa and the Midwest grown in addition to soybeans is corn. And corn is a non-host crop. Everything I'm going to say here in the next minute or so that relates to corn would also apply to other non-host crops. But of course, working in Iowa, I really only think about soybeans and, on a brief moment, corn. So I'm happy to report that when the farmers I work with grow corn in a field infested with SCN, numbers decrease. And the way they decrease is there's all these SCN eggs in the soil, and some hatch, and they release the little juvenile that's a weak link in the life cycle. That juvenile has to get into a soybean root and start feeding, or it's either going to starve or something else that lives in the soil is going to eat it for lunch, because there's lots of natural enemies in the soil for these little soybean cyst nematode juvenile worms. And so what we've seen over the years or the decades is in 1 year of corn following soybeans, the egg count, the egg number, will decrease as little as 5 or 10% in that year to as much as 45 or 50% if we're really lucky. And we don't understand why there's such a wide range of decreases, but just observationally looking over the year, sometimes it's a little, sometimes it's as much as it'll drop by half. So that's great news that we want farmers to continue to rotate corn with soybeans for this very reason. But unfortunately, Mother Nature had evolved some survival strategies for soybean cyst nematode, in that if a farmer grew a second year of corn, they're not going to see another 50% drop in those egg numbers, because what's left in the soil are mostly eggs that are dormant at that point. And soybean cyst nematode has evolved to have genetically programmed eggs. Some hatch just when it's warm enough and moist enough. Some hatch when they sense chemicals given off by soybean roots, and then some don't hatch no matter what you do to them. They're just dormant, and they'll stay unhatched for a period of 4, 5, 6, 7, some people say 10 years. So back to growing corn, first year corn gives you the largest decrease, because lots of eggs that are not dormant are going to hatch and starve. Second year corn, there'll still be some eggs hatching, and those worms are going to starve as well, but it's nowhere near as much as first year corn. And by the time you get to third year corn or third year of any non-host, it's mostly dormant eggs that are left behind in the soil, and those are going to slowly hatch out over a period of who knows how long, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. So I don't advocate switching to continuous corn to get rid of SCN. It would take a decade or more, but you definitely want to rotate corn and soybean, and in extreme situations even do 2 years of corn to stretch out those soybean years. So I'm a big proponent of using non-host crops with resistant soybeans. Now, the other really interesting thing that's just happened in the last 10 years or so is seed treatments. And so in the mid-2000s, I think Avicta from Syngenta was the first nematode protectant seed treatment that came on the market, and now we have a great variety of them. And so there is literally 10 to 12 different nematode protectant seed treatments that farmers can buy and put on their soybeans to help protect that growing soybean root against soybean cyst nematode. And we certainly don't have time to cover all the different products and their active ingredients and all that, but I've put a table together that's available in a PDF file, and much like the other publications I've mentioned in this presentation, I'm happy to share that PDF file if folks email either me or you. And there's a wide variety of active ingredients and targeted nematodes and modes of action and so forth. So lots of new options with that.
We know that we get some protection from STS when you use a Levo or Saltra, okay? and we know we get some protection from SCN, but I'm getting the question, do we need to be stacking another nematicide seed treatment on top of Olivo or Saltro? I have an opinion, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, as I've said a couple times in this video, I'm a geek, a science geek, and so I like to refer to data, and usually I generate my own data. So imagine that we actually have some experiments we've conducted to help answer your question. So we do small plot experiments at 9 locations across Iowa to look at seed treatments, and we don't do battle of the bands. We don't put all the seed treatments head to head against each other, but we compare the nematode seed treatment on its base compared to the base alone. So it kind of gets to what's the seed treatment doing for nematode protection on top of the base. The other thing is, obviously these are SCN infested fields, and we also pick fields that do not have a history of SDS. So we want to avoid having, in our yield data, the yield being increased because of SDS control, because we're targeting SCN. And then to check against that an extra, we also scout our plots once we get into August and September, and we have a critical percent incidence where if a certain number of plots are showing SDS symptoms, then we're not going to use the data from that experiment for SCN, because any yield results could be indicative of SDS control rather than SCN control. So having said all that, we do these small plot experiments across the state. We do them just like the variety trial experiments, 4-row plots. We sample beginning and end of season SCN numbers from the center 2 rows. We harvest the center 2 rows, and we measure yield and the change in nematode numbers. And this is funded by the soybean checkoff through the Iowa Soybean Association. And so we've been doing this for a while. Since 2014, we've done these experiments, and we've run the gamut. We've tested Clariva, Olivo, Aveo, Nemastrike, Trunemco, Saltro, and Nemasect. And it totals about 180 some different experiments. And it's hard to present the results of 180 some experiments to a crowd, but I've created a summary table, and when we look at the summary table, I have them organized, the table organized by the years that we did it. And so the earliest data we have is Clariva. We have data from Olivo from 2015 to 2017, and now we're starting to test it again. We have Aveo 2017 to 2020. Nemastrike, we won't talk about that. Nobody has availability of Nemastrike. And then Trunemco, Saltro, and Nemasect in the most recent years. And without calling out an individual product, all of these products we see, most all of them will provide a significant yield increase in some of our experiments. But our big problem is it's not in a high enough frequency. So for example, Olivo, we've tested it in 36 different experiments, but in only 5 of those 36 experiments did we see a significant yield increase. That's 14%. Now when we did get a yield increase with Olivo, it was 3 or 4 bushels per acre, so it more than paid for the cost of the product. I'll also mention Saltro, because you mentioned it earlier. Saltro, we've only tested in 2020 and 2021, so that's 18 experiments. 4 out of 18 experiments had a significant yield increase, but that yield increase was 2 bushels per acre on average, and that more than paid for the product. And I want to remind people viewing this again that these are fields that do not have a history of SDS, and then we scout the plots to see if there's visual symptoms of SDS, and they aren't included in the summary numbers that I've just spoken of. So I think the chances of getting SCN control from a Saltro and Olivo are just as likely as any other product. And so, in other words, I think we're seeing the potential for double benefit. We're certainly seeing a benefit of nematode control with Olivo and Saltro, as well as some of the other products I mentioned. And one would presume, based on your observations, that Olivo and Saltro are providing SDS benefit as well. But I've not trying to experimentally tried to deal with SCN and SDS together at the same time.
Okay, Dr. Tilka, so I hear and I even read a little bit in some science publications that, cover crops might be able to provide some benefit to controlling soybean cyst nematode. What are your thoughts there? What are your observations?
Well, you said it literally how I would say it. Cover crops might provide a benefit to soybean cyst nematode. Unfortunately, I've also read some things in the popular press that say that they do provide it and that they're more unequivocal in their statement, and that's absolutely not true. So there are some publications, well, this all started in Europe. So in Europe, they don't have soybean cyst nematode, but they have sugar beet cyst nematode. And there's some valid scientific studies out of Europe that showed that certain cover crops can reduce the egg numbers of sugar beet cyst nematode. And so the idea, the hope is that we could grow cover crops and get some benefit in reducing SCN numbers in the soil. And turns out that's true, but not always. And so the word I use is variable. There's only 3 or 4, maybe 5 papers in the scientific literature about cover crops and SCN in the United States. And a lot of them, almost all of them, are more greenhouse studies than field studies. There's only 2 field studies that have been published, and it found in some experiments in some years SCN egg numbers decreased after the cover crop was grown compared to when the cover crop was seeded. And to even get a little more pointed on it, the specific cover crops that seem to have this effect are daikon radish, cereal rye, and annual ryegrass. But the hit rate, if you will, the benefit rate, is something like 13 to 22% of the experiments showed a benefit. And so that's the essence of the word variable that I use to describe it. And even though I'm a kind of a critic of people that blindly say cover crops can manage SCN, we've done some of our own studies, and we found an interesting mechanism in the greenhouse that we may explore in the field, and that is that we did experiments and compared egg numbers with cover crops beginning and end of season or beginning and end of experiment in the greenhouse. We didn't see any differences, but what we did when the experiment was over, we grew soybeans in that soil, and we found that susceptible soybeans had fewer SCN females following a couple different cover crops, and that would translate to growing soybeans after you grew your cover crops. Now, this research has not been validated in the field, but it gives a hint of possibility that maybe early season soybeans are protected a little bit from SCN as kind of a residual effect of cover crops, and specifically the ones, and we just published this paper very recently, the specific ones that we saw this effect were annual ryegrass, cereal rye, daikon radish, and a couple mixes. So to kind of put a summary on it, cover crops, nobody should be growing cover crops as the foundation of managing SCN, and it'll be an accidental happy accident if you get some SCN control along with the conservation benefits that you get with cover crops. So can't say it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen reliably.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Tilka, if you were a farmer, how would you go about managing to reduce the resistance to PI 88788, which is the most common source of resistant other? What would you do to break that cycle?
That's a great question. What I hear you asking me is, what should farmers do moving forward to slow down that breakdown of resistance and manage SCN moving forward? So, but let's pretend I'm a farmer who got a biology degree and learned about integrated pest management, because that's what I'm going to do. So we've covered in this video kind of the bases. I'm going to want to grow, and I'm going to tell my fellow farmers to grow non-host crops, corn, if you will, in rotation with resistant soybean varieties. And then in those soybean years, I'm going to preach to high heaven about looking for varieties that are not with the PI 88788 resistance to rotate in with the common 88788 varieties. We can't not grow PI 88788 because they're almost everything that's available. If you can get varieties with peaking resistance, I should tell you, you don't want to switch to continuous peaking resistance, because we will go down the same path of the breakdown of resistance as we would for 88788. So integrated pest management means diversity. So we want to look for growing beans with resistance from Peking. When I mentioned earlier, there's 2 varieties with resistance from PI 89772. And then there are university researchers developing other genotypes, other soybeans with different resistance genes. Now, the one caveat there is these have been developed here in the past several years, but they don't ever seem to be brought to market by seed companies for farmers to purchase. So the only way the new resistance genes are going to help farmers moving forward is if the seed companies integrate those new resistance genes into their breeding programs and actually eventually start selling varieties with the new resistance genes. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, another hopeful thing we have out there in the future is BASF is developing varieties with Bt SCN resistance, and unless there's some unexpected result, I anticipate that in a number of years, I said 5 to 10 years earlier, I don't know, it could be even sooner than that. But even when that comes on the market, we don't want to stop using 88788 and Peking resistance. We want to broaden our integrated pest management. And then, of course, non-host crops, resistant soybeans. The third thing that we've talked about today is the nematode protectant seed treatments. We want to continue to use those 3 things for integrated management of soybean cyst nematode moving forward. And to go back to something you talked about very early in our conversation today, farmers not maybe wanting to grow that Peking resistance because it lags a couple bushels per acre behind. You got to think long term. And I can guarantee you that couple bushel per acre lag of a resistant variety with Peking is going to be nothing compared to the yield drag they get as SCN continues to bring down yields of varieties with PI 88788 resistance.
Well, Greg, in conclusion here, I'd like to thank Iowa State University for letting us use the beautiful Parks Library today. I'd like to especially thank you for sharing your years of expertise regarding soybean cyst nematode and how to manage them. And I'd like to thank the audience for tuning in today, and I hope you learned something. Finally, I would just like to reiterate that I thoroughly believe that we're losing much more yield due to soybean cyst nematode in most of our fields than you probably think, which is why I call to action to have you follow some of the recommendations that Greg and I talked about today. Rotation, soybean cyst nematode seed treatments, consider, switching in trades. So again, thank you for your time and thanks for listening.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow.
Excellence.
And agronomy
Development.
Hi, welcome back. Thank you to both of our presenters for that excellent presentation. And we are fortunate enough to have both Dr. Vossenkemper and Dr. Tilka with us today to take Q&A. So let's get started. The first question that has come through from the YouTube chat is, why did the susceptible yield do better than the 8878 variety?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in the field, and the one thing that was missing from those graphs, those bar graphs, are statistics. And so not every numerical difference is a statistical difference, but there was, if you remember, this was the bar graph where there were 3 susceptibles on the right and then a bunch of gray 88788 varieties in the middle, and 2 really tall bars for yield with Peking green bars on the left side. And there was one of the 3 susceptibles that had a larger bar than the other. I just looked it up as the question came in. That was 54.3 bushels per acre, that particular susceptible. Whereas a lot of the resistant varieties with 88788 were around 54 all the way up to 58.7 bushels per acre. So that one susceptible didn't out yield all the 88788 varieties, but it was larger, even statistically greater than many of the others. And there's 2 things at play. One is sometimes varieties are mischaracterized in terms of SCN resistance. and or SCN susceptibility. So that might be an eye-opening thing. And this very well could be an instance of that where variety is called susceptible to SCN when it does have some background resistance. And I didn't have time to look up our data, but we test all of our susceptible checks in the greenhouse to see how susceptible they are. And again, I didn't have time to look up the specific numbers, but that could be an instance where there really was a suppression of SCN reproduction by that susceptible variety, I should say susceptible variety, and it translated to some yield increase. The other thing, which we don't have really time to get into, is separate from resistance, there's a concept called tolerance in soybeans. And what that means is certain soybean varieties suffer more or less than others, even though they might allow the same level of SCN reproduction. And that could very well be at play as well with that particular variety. It could have been more tolerant than the other two susceptible, but I have a sinking feeling that it was one of the ones that wasn't completely susceptible, and it might have had some level of resistance in it. But that's a good observation.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that came through over the email. There are some companies suggesting they can use DNA samples from the soil to detect SCN and the numbers of them. Is this true? Is this better than traditional SCN sampling? I think one of the companies is called Pattern Egg.
Yeah, I've actually communicated with several of these companies, including Pattern Egg, I think. The first part of the question is, yes, is this true? It's true that you can detect DNA of soybean cyst nematode from a soil sample using molecular methods. The part that I struggle with, and I've not seen anybody give a good answer to, is how does that translate to management at the field level? And at least some of these companies early on, they were testing 0.5 grams of soil. And I mean, that would, it's hard to describe how little soil that is. And how do you translate what happens in 0.5 grams or even 5 grams of soil to an 80-acre field? So it's wonderful technology that we can do that, but I've not seen a good implementation plan to translate molecular results to field management. And the ones that want feedback from me, I've shared that response. And so I think it can be done. I don't know how you translate testing a tiny amount of soil into management recommendations, or even just grasping the idea of how bad the SCN infestation is in an 80-acre field.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question through the email. If Peking is such a good SCN trait, why aren't the seed companies releasing more of them?
Well, we are a victim of our own success, in my opinion. So first, I should say I'm not in the seed business, never have been, never will be probably, but trying to reason out why that situation is what it is, my thought is if you wanted in the seed company to develop a new variety right now, you probably wouldn't start from scratch. In other words, you probably wouldn't start with a completely susceptible variety and make a cross with Peking and then do back crossing and try and advance development of a new variety. Instead, I think what you would do is start with other things that are in your program already. And if you can remember my bar graph of what sources of resistance show up in varieties over the last 30 years, 95% of varieties that exist had 88788. So if a company wanted to develop a new variety, almost everything in their breeding program probably has 88788 resistance in it already. So they would have to come to grips with, financially and time-wise, taking a bigger step back and developing new varieties with Peking resistance. And the last thing I'll point out is there's really no price premium charged for SCN resistant seed. And so to take that step back and do a lot more work to develop new varieties with Peking resistance, there's probably not the opportunity to recover that cost as a business, because farmers have never paid for SCN resistance in the past. And that poses an interesting question for the future that we don't need to talk about today, is what will the transgenic trait, what will the tech fee be when that BT resistance comes to market in the future?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Next question from the email again. You mentioned the BASF BT trait. Is there any clearer timeline on when that will be available?
Jake, is this one where I should pass on to you?
Sure, yeah. We had talked about that when we were putting together the video, Greg, and you speculated it could be 5 to 10 years, and curiosity always gets me. So after our conversation, I talked to several folks within BASF, and they said the EPA is estimating commercial launch between 2026 and 2028. So that would be 4 to 6 years. And I think that's rough, of course, but a little more definition than 5 to 10.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the email. You talked a lot about SCN soil sampling. When should that be done?
The short answer, the cutesy answer, would be whenever you're able to do it is when it should be done. But the optimum time would be in the fall because of two things. One, it is a whole lot easier to zigzag your way through a field of corn or soybeans to pull soil cores if there's no crop to kind of walk through. The best optimum thing I would recommend is sampling fields of corn stalks in the fall after harvest, so after the crop has been harvested, fields that will have soybeans grown the next growing season. So I know it's human nature, you'd want to sample the soybean fields that have been harvested, and you can do that if you want to maybe see if soybean cyst nematode affected or dinged the yields of the soybean crop you just harvested. But moving forward, any field that's going to have soybeans planted the next growing season, those are the fields in the fall that would be best to pull soil samples from. Of course, if you don't get that done, and we're now talking, we're in February here, at least when this is appearing live, there is time in the spring when it can be done. Once the ground warms up and all the snow and ice has thawed and it drains a little bit, there's a window of time in the spring when this can be done as well. Again, thinking for fields that are going to have soybeans planted in them this upcoming or this spring. But the time period is much shorter to get that done and get your results. And the reason fall is so nice to do that is because you have time to come up with a management plan and look for varieties and think about seed treatments and other things. So it buys you time when you do this sampling in the fall preceding a soybean crop.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you. Another question from the email is, I live in eastern Iowa. I've never seen soybean cyst nematode damage in my field, but your talk suggests it's everywhere. What is a good way to find out if I do, or are there any visual signs that I can look for?
Yeah, so first off, it's not everywhere. It's probably in 70% of the fields in the state of Iowa, and eastern Iowa, probably it's in much less. And in north central and northwest Iowa, it's probably in way more than 70% of the field. So just to put a little perspective on that. The second interesting part of that question was, I've never seen damage or never seen symptoms. And that's a really troublesome part of this nematode is unless there's severe conditions, you could be losing 5, 10, 15 bushels per acre and not see sick looking soybeans above ground. So my advice would be to soil sample or during the growing season, and I'd say starting about 6-7 weeks after planting through the month of August, you can dig roots of soybean plants, shake the soil off the roots and look for the little white females that are on the roots. And if you need help, if you're not sure knowing what to look for, you could turn to county extension, or a lot of agribusiness have agronomists that know what to look for. And that once you've seen it once, you know how you can dig roots and look for it on your own.
Okay,
So,
good. Oh, go ahead.
Greg and Lisa, I have something to add if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So, this goes back to the question that was just asked. So we have a customer who's a very loyal customer of Liqui-Grow's, and I work with him quite often. And this fall, he sent me a bunch of yield data from 3 farms that he has. And, there's quite a lot of yield data he's collected over the years. And this one farm, it's 5 to 10 bushels off the other farms. The other farms average in the 70s. And this farm in question averages in the 60s to low 70s. So it's not completely different. And he asked me, what's wrong with this farm? Well, I looked at the soil test, I looked at the soil type, I looked at a bunch of aerial imagery to try to see if drainage was an issue. And there's nothing that was readily available to me to explain why the differences were. During this conference call, I got the soybean cyst nematode egg counts back. Guess what? I'm not kidding you. During this conference call, the field in question had egg counts of around 7,000, and the 2 fields that were higher yielding had egg counts below 1,000. So there you go. Take soil samples.
Okay. Thank you very much for adding that. I have another question from the email. I don't put seed treatment on my beans. Can I just use Alivo or Celtro?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the nature of that question. Alivo and Saltro are seed treatments, but in our experiments, both of them have had the same frequency of providing a yield increase. So, and I don't know that I explained very well in the video that we compare Alivo and Saltro or any of the ones we're studying to its base. So the Alivo and Saltro, I believe they're both sold on top of a base insecticide fungicide seed treatment. So that's the comparison we make. Saltro plus its base versus the base alone, Alivo plus its base versus Alivo alone, or versus the base alone. And that's when we see the yield increases. So if the question is if they can get Alivo or Saltro alone without a base, I've never tested that. You might have heard me say a few times, I'm a data-driven person. And so I'm a little uneasy about saying, sure, that should work, but logic tells me that there's a chance that it would work just Alivo alone or Saltro alone.
So the answer to the question is, you can get Alivo or Saltro treated without other fungicides or insecticides. Generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend that. And that could get into a long conversation other than generally, we see an economic return to using other fungicide insecticide treatments generally. And if the grower wants to contact me directly, we can have a long conversation about which environments you'd be more likely to see a consistent return from seed treatments and which environments you would not. But that could be a lengthy conversation. And I think we're about out of time.
I do have one more question from the chat. For beans on beans, should I definitely plant Peking?
Being a biologist, I never use words like definitely or always, but yeah, sure. If you have to plant something, and the 2 choices are Peking or 88788, so yes. I'm a little nervous not knowing anything more about it, but beans on beans is a bad idea if you have cyst nematode. I'm assuming this field is not known whether there is SCN or not. And so that would be a safety for sure to grow a Peking variety instead of an 88788 variety. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so that's all. I have no other questions that have come through. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank both of you. This was an excellent hour of information. And thanks to everybody who joined us today on YouTube. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, or you think of something afterwards, you can always contact your Liqui-Grow rep, your local rep, or you can still email us at questions@liqui-grow.com. That link is always live, and you can send a question in and we will get back to you. We hope that we see you at the rest of our sessions next week. Our next session is on Tuesday, February 15th at 9 o'clock in the morning. It is going to be a panel discussion on the economy, nitrogen, grain markets, all things economic. It's going to be a very good session with lots of good information. The other thing I will say is, if you like our programming and you want to see more of it, then you can like this video, and you can also subscribe to our channel, the Liqui-Grow YouTube channel. We post content on there on a regular basis, and if you like our videos and subscribe to our channel, then that will make sure that you don't miss anything. Thanks again for logging in today, and we will see you all next Tuesday.